Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flare. Hope you're all doing very well today, and what a momentous day it is. What a time to be alive. Life is good. Why is life so good? Why is today such a glorious day? Well, my friends, that is because summer is drawing to a close. We are leaving the summer behind us. The weather is turning cooler. We're not going to be sweating all over the place any longer. The leaves are going to turn. It's the most beautiful time of the year, in my opinion. And perhaps more importantly, more directly related to our interests on this channel, the Hogaak summer is what has drawn to an end. The Faithless summer, the Graveyard summer has come to an end, and that's right, it will be replaced by an autumn where fair mid-range decks rule the roost, or at least that is our hope and our intent. What am I talking about? Well, if you didn't know, now you know. We've got three massive changes to the modern format as of today. Hogaak Arisen Necropolis, you're banned. Faithless Looting, you are also banned. And Stoneforge Mystic is unbanned. This would be the biggest shakeup since Jace and Bloodbraid Elf were unbanned. It arguably is even bigger than that, time will tell, but these are two very important bans along with a unban of potentially equal import to the other two. The only thing that competes in recent years is Modern Horizons as far as shakeups go, so it's been a wild few months here for MTG Modern players, and I am here by popular demand. I had people blowing up my phone all morning at work. Well, I came straight home, ran straight home for you to make this video, so here we go. We're going to break down these two bans, this unbanning. We're going to talk about the cards whose stock goes up, the cards whose stock goes down. We're going to touch on each of the major BGx archetypes while doing so, and we're going to talk about what this means for the format going forward. But either way, my friends, as a BGx player, as an all-in fair mid-range green-black player, I am hyped, and so too should you be, in my opinion. So here we go. We're going to analyze all of the aforementioned things. Thank you to all Patreon supporters who make this content possible. And without further ado, let's talk about the bans. So we'll get this one out of the way first, guys. Everybody knew this guy had his days numbered. You could even talk to someone on the street who's never played this game before, never even heard of the game, and they'll be like, oh yeah, Hogaak for sure is getting banned. Like, it was known, it was widely known, and so it came to pass. Hogaak Arisen Necropolis, no longer with us. Not gonna lie, I'm not really gonna miss you. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of interesting games if the opponent didn't have a nut draw on the Hogaak deck, and if we had like a turn 1 discard and a turn 2 scavenging ooze, often it very much was a game of many decisions that we like to see. But way too often it was a turn 2 Hogaak, especially on the play. You can't really disrupt it no matter what you do unless you have the hard graveyard hate in your opening hand like Nile Spellbomb or Leyline of the Void. And, by now, it is clear to all and sundry that free spells are busted. We have to be very careful when designing free spells, Convoke and Delve, both very powerful abilities, stapled together onto one recursive, evasive 8/8. Yeah, it was a problem. Not much more to say about it. This was a ban that everyone knew was coming. It is well-deserved, and we will see you in older formats, I guess, if ever. So, bye-bye, Hogaak. Let's move on. Well, as we move on to Faithless Looting, I suppose I probably should show you the reasoning behind these decisions, all of which I agree with, by the way. I should also state that up front. I agree with all three banning decisions, and, I won't read you the whole thing. Of course, you can do that yourself, but a couple interesting points that I do wish to highlight. It's clear that Hogaak is the crux of the problem. I think that's very, very clear. You can't avoid that truth for too much longer. But moving on to the looting aspect of things, this is a very, very important phrase. Coming out of this period of an unhealthy modern metagame, I don't really think it should be overlooked how significant it is that Wizards does own the fact that the modern metagame was unhealthy. There's been a great deal of talk about diversity. Like, almost to the point where you started to suspect that if the format was diverse, it was good in their eyes. And of course, diversity is part of a healthy format, but if all of the diversity that we're seeing is just various shades of linearity, that is, of course, not healthy in terms of design and in terms of structure, and it leads to extremely unhealthy gameplay. There can be such a thing as too much diversity, and even if we weren't in that territory yet, we do know there are other metrics by which to measure the health of a metagame. So very, very impressed, frankly, to hear Wizards own it straight up just like that. The metagame was unhealthy. Now, we on this channel, we Rock players, we Jund and Abzan and Sultai players, we always adapt, right? We always roll the punches, but it is definitely something that needed to be corrected, and this is their chance to correct it. And they're mentioning the main deck presence of these really hard, really narrow, outside of that unhealthy meta graveyard hate pieces. Couldn't agree more. But here is what we need to talk about. The key card enabling. Keyword enabling. The majority of these graveyard focused decks is Faithless Looting. And they go on to cite the data and cite how at basically any stage for the last long while, you take a snapshot of any given point in the meta and there is a looting deck on top. Often multiple looting decks in the top few. No question about that. That's definitely true. But let's go back to this opening sentence. So opinions are pretty firmly split from what I have read from the community as a whole. There are many people who agree with Wizards here and say that looting has to go. Looting is too much of a consistency tool. The disadvantage built into it is not really a disadvantage at all. In basically any deck that's going to play it, maybe one or two exceptions, but for all intents and purposes, the built-in card disadvantage is not actually there. In fact, it's more like card advantage in many, many use cases. And it's restricting design space because anything that uses the graveyard in an interesting way is liable to be busted in conjunction with Faithless Looting if it's of inherently sufficient power level to see play. So there are a lot of people who would agree with Wizards here that looting was a problem. It was a structural problem in the format. It is an elephant in the room, and while it should not have really been first on anyone's list to ban, I think Hogaak was a more egregious offender, and it was worth trying things like banning Bridge from Below. I'm on board with all that. I don't think looting should have been the first on the chopping block, but as time went on, I think it became clear that looting was kind of an unavoidable problem. And I fall into this camp, but to give the other side its due, there are a lot of people who say we should not be banning enablers, we should be banning payoffs. To me, I understand the argument. I at least understand that it is useful to draw the distinction between an enabler and a payoff if we're going to correctly analyze what's going on, whether things are too powerful or too consistent or both, and why. However, I do not agree with the kind of mathematical equation of banning enabler bad, banning payoff good. I don't think that's correct. I don't think there needs to be a hard and fast rule. If somebody wanted to say we should try to ban payoffs more readily than we do enablers because the enablers can, help sustain a variety of decks, sure, I can support that, but I don't think it's correct to say that we should never ban enablers, and neither does Wizards because looting is gone. So that's kind of the philosophical, let's try that again, the philosophical take on why it is inherently not wrong to ban looting. But in terms of the practical fallout from this decision, well, just look at it. These numbers are massive. Looting is seeing play in a ton of top modern decks, and many of these modern decks are putting up enormous results. Of course, this will all change moving forward, but Hogaak at the very top, no surprises there. A few different variants of Phoenix, including a green splash one a little bit further down here, but lots of different Phoenix variants, all of which do depend on looting very significantly. And then, of course, we have other graveyard-based decks like Reanimator, Dredge, and then we have just a couple of what we would consider more fair decks. We do have Mardu Pyromancer. Now, Mardu Pyromancer is worth talking about briefly. So Mardu was a deck that was pretty popular for a while and then died off. It really fell off a cliff. Got a little bit of a shot in the arm from Modern Horizons because cards like Seasoned Pyromancer, Smiting Helix, a lot of these fairer cards that do utilize the graveyard helped make the Faithless Looting Young Pyromancer shell a lot stronger and have different angles of attack. Without looting, the question becomes, does Mardu have what it takes to compete as a mid-range deck while it's staying above ground, basically, for lack of a better term? You can still play your Seasoned Pyromancer, you can still get some synergy that way, but basically, is the Mardu color trio better than other alternatives? And, maybe Stoneforge Mystic even fits in there. Who knows? So that's an open question. But certainly the Mardu Pyromancer builds as we know them will have to change radically to adapt. And probably the same is true for Rakdos Elementals. Of course, they're trying to abuse, Unearth style effects. That gets a lot more awkward with looting. And of course, remember, looting was a consistency tool for all of these decks. Yes, it's card disadvantage, but even in a fair deck, you can mitigate that by, number one, having lots of value out of the graveyard, and number two, you play forms of interaction that are bad late game, like discard spells, or not live in every matchup like Fatal Push, just to give a couple examples. Well, Faithless Looting helps you loot them away. You can even include cards like Blood Moon in your deck that are very high variance. They can give you a free win, or they can do stone cold nothing. They could even hurt you. When you have 4 Faithless Looting in your deck and the ability to even flashback looting itself for practically 8 copies of the card, you can afford to play those very powerful pieces and not be as hurt by either looting's disadvantage itself or the card, the higher variance cards themselves being dead. So we're going to see the fair decks incorporating looting have to really re-examine what's going on, but they may or may not come out stronger on the other side, or at least comparable. I do not believe any of the more all-in graveyard decks are going to be anywhere near as strong without Faithless Looting. Obviously, the Hogaak deck is kind of dead in the water as we know it. No Hogaak, no looting. Yeah, there goes a whole lot of the power in your deck. But moving on, to these Phoenix decks, of course, a lot of people have said that Phoenix is kind of a misnomer for those decks anyway. They're almost more thing-in-the-ice decks already. Like, even with looting in the format, they were almost more dependent upon thing-in-the-ice than they were upon Arclight Phoenix. And now without looting, one wonders whether Phoenix will even remain in these decks. I don't think so. And not as we know them. They could shift to more of a Spells Matter deck, still leaning on thing-in-the-ice, but playing other payoffs that don't use the graveyard or don't need looting to really get them there. Obviously, Dredge is going to continue to be a big factor insofar as the all-in graveyard decks go. But without looting, it's a lot worse. It is a lot worse. They're going to go back to stuff like Insolent Neonate. There are replacements, just none of them are anywhere near as powerful and as consistency enabling overall. But don't expect Dredge to go away fully by any means. It will become more of a deck that waxes and wanes with the meta, one imagines, maybe more of a tier 2 deck. But the Dredge players will figure out a way to make the deck good again, no question about it. Here's one word of warning. To tamp down a little bit on the celebrations that are going on in the BGx community right now. Beware, my friends, beware of a specific graveyard deck that you do not see here on this list. That is Living End. Living End, of course, does not play Faithless Looting, most variants, and specifically the traditional Jund Living End variant that is the best against us. Living End is a all-in graveyard deck that is extremely good against BGx Midrange decks. Our literal worst matchup in all of Modern, if you ask me. And, of course, the looting ban helps Jund Living End, because there is going to be less graveyard hate flying around the format. Their deck is not as fast, and it's not as resilient to hate, and it's not as able to power through it. So Living End was chased out of the meta by Hogaak and by Mono Red Phoenix and by Dredge. But with all of those decks taking a huge step back, well, I'm afraid, I'm wary, I should say, about Living End having its time to shine. That would be very, very bad for us. So that's the word of caution, but overall, that's what you can expect to see as far as the decks that are using looting. What changes they're going to make will remain to be seen exactly, but overall, everything on this list is going to have to really reevaluate what it's up to in Modern. So moving on, my friends, we are going to talk about why they unbanned Stoneforge Mystic. So they acknowledge power creep. As the card pool expands, new combos are found, new value cards are printed, the format gets more powerful over time, almost by definition, and, therefore they need to revisit whether certain cards still belong on the ban list, and Stoneforge Mystic has been on the tip of people's tongues for a very long time. When will she be unbanned? It's almost a meme, like, well, I got turn 1'd by Neobrand again. It's a good thing Stoneforge isn't in the format, though, you get it. But, there is a decent argument for having left her banned, and part of it is what Wizard says here, that she is at her strongest against straightforward decks that play to the battlefield. There's definitely some truth to that. On the other hand, she is also best in those decks, She rewards interaction because on her own, she is not a clock that can erase a combo deck. On her own, she is not going to compete with the payoffs of Tron if you're not disrupting Tron. But if you've got her in a shell that plays some discard or some permission and is otherwise seeking to interact, yeah, she thrives. So she's kind of good with and against fair decks, but hopefully she's going to give a boost kind of structurally to the fair decks, give them a very powerful threat that can serve a variety of roles, kind of a Swiss Army knife style threat, if you will. So, of course, they do caution that if Stoneforge Mystic becomes too powerful or too homogenizing, like to the point where every deck splashing white is going to play her, then they basically reserve the right, and you're fairly warned that they might have to reban her, just like they did Golgari Grave Troll. Now, I don't expect that to happen. Neither do they. They think it's unlikely. I don't expect that to happen, but I also disagree with some of the arguments you've seen in the past where people are like, Stoneforge Mystic wouldn't even do anything in Modern. I disagree. I think this card is going to be strong. I think it's going to be very, very nice. Maybe not in quite as many shells as people expect, but I also think it's going to have a higher ceiling and a higher impact in the shells that she's really, really well suited to. That's kind of my prediction. Some people think she's going to homogenize all white decks into playing her. I don't agree. Some people think that she's going to be not strong enough to make an impact. I also don't agree. So we'll see how it all goes. Of course, it's almost a fool's game to try to predict how these things will shake out exactly. But those are my thoughts. And so as for what she does, well, she's a good old 1-2. Never thought I'd be impressed by the stat line of a 1-2, but with Renin 6 and Plague Engineer in the format and Lava Dart, in addition to pre-existing, pre-Modern Horizons X1 hate, well, that second point of toughness comes at a premium. It's actually pretty sweet right now, and definitely, if we're thinking of the mid-range autumn, as I said, of the fair autumn taking over, well, you've got to think about how it lines up against Jund and against Rock and all that stuff if you want to play Stoneforge Mystic. So against Renin 6, against Plague Man, she does force them to find an actual kill spell at the least. Now, of course, you're tutoring up an equipment on an enter the battlefield trigger, so this is inherently something that a fair deck wants to do. You get your ETB value, which is something that's actually kind of lacking relative to other decks in the green-black archetype. You get your ETB value, you're already up a card. That's a beautiful thing. And then on top of that, she, of course, allows you to cheat cards in at a cut rate, and Batterskull is the greatest example of that, the most likely to be played example. of course, getting your 5-drop down for 2 is pretty good, especially when you tutored it after casting your 2-drop. And then on top of that, Batterskull is a living weapon. So one of the reasons equipment in general doesn't see Modern play is because it's very clunky. You open yourself up to a massive tempo blowout if you spend a turn casting the equipment and then spend a turn trying to equip it only to have your equipped creature get removed or even have the artifact itself get removed. The fact that Batterskull is a living weapon means it is not vulnerable to those types of blowouts, and of course you're getting a very, very good discount on it if you cheat it in with Stoneforge Mystic. It's just a very efficient tool all around, and of course it is a very good stabilizer against those fair decks, against aggro decks, against burn, and ether vial decks, tribal decks, so on and so forth. Very, very nice, very good in grindy games. Of course you can buy it back and redeploy it to even create a new germ if you're totally out of threats. So obviously an awesome card. So what does the presence of Stoneforge mean for this format? Well, of course, there's going to be a lot of unpredictable, ripple effects from her Unbend. But I can speculate on a few things. A few things I think are pretty much set in stone, very confident about them, and a few things are definitely shooting a bit more from the hip. So if we take a look at the Modern metagame, my friends, with the 2 bans and the 1 unban in mind, let's just look at the top, 20 decks or so. Hogaak, wrecked by the Hogaak ban. Burn, definitely going to struggle against a Stoneforge Mystic heavy meta because, of course, Batterskull, the swords might get techie, we'll get into that in a little bit, but Batterskull seems like a guaranteed minimum 1 of in every Stoneforge Mystic deck as a tutor target, and it's going to be main deck, so Burn doesn't like to see that at all. Jund, of course, definitely doesn't hate to see the looting in Hogaak ban, and has the tools to compete with other value decks packing Stoneforge Mystic, but as mentioned, the 1-2 nature of Mystic means that it doesn't exactly get blown out by Jund's new toys that easily. So Jund is definitely here to stay, definitely a very strong green-black deck. The whole green-black archetype, guys, is looking really strong. If you're like me, and if you committed to being an all-in green-black player a while ago, you're probably very happy right now. But still, Jund has a new competitor in the form of Abzan or maybe Esper Bant. We'll see how it all goes. But Mono Red Phoenix, of course, absolutely wrecked by the looting ban and hates to see Batterskull on the field on turn 3. However, we get here to spot 5, Tron. Tron loves everything that just happened today. Tron loves the Hogaak ban. Tron loves the looting ban. These are the types of decks that can outrace Tron and can even win through most Tron payoffs in relatively consistent fashion. And if we're looking at mid-range decks overall getting a huge boost, well, Tron preys upon mid-range decks. So I will have a couple kind of words of caution, maybe some moderately pessimistic takes for those of us who are devoted green-black rock players a little bit later on. But the one thing I'll say that's very, very good for the rock aficionados is that we are the best equipped to beat Tron of all the BGx flavors because, of course, we do play Field of Ruin main deck, and that goes a long, long way. We play more copies of Assassin's Trophy. That's also very helpful. So, that said, no matter what your flavor of BGx, Tron is definitely going to be on the rise, in my opinion. And, we'll talk more about cards whose stock will rise because of that, but moving on. Blue-White Control. Yeah, Blue-White Control definitely seems happy about these bans overall. And of course, many will speculate that Stoneforge Mystic will find a place in Blue-White Control as a finisher. That's going to take some retooling of the decks, for sure, no question about that, but you'll see it. It might be more of a blue-white mid-range when it's all said and done. It's obviously difficult to say, but I think overall Blue-White Control is definitely a winner here, and of course Stoneforge Mystic is decent against Blue-White Control decks in her own right, though, simply because she's a 2-for-1, she's a credible threat, all that good stuff. Moving on, Crixus Ursa. Many have said this is a deck that's just a little underrated or just poised to take off and hasn't really done so yet. Well, now seems like the perfect opportunity. So, another artifact-based deck, much like Tron, that might be poised to shoot way, way up in the meta. And we'll talk a little bit about what to do to deal with that in the near future, but keep that in mind. Eldrazi Tron, I predicted a while ago, during the Bridge from Below ban actually, that Eldrazi Tron would fall off and Green Tron would take its place. Looks like I was mostly right. I was thinking I was a little bit wrong for a while, but it just took a little while to really catch on. And the major reason I was thinking that is because I kind of assumed the Hogaak deck wouldn't still be far and away the most powerful deck in the format even after the Bridge ban, right? But with Hogaak gone, with Looting gone, with Mono Red Phoenix and similar decks looking a lot worse, so does this card. So does Chalice of the Void out of Eldrazi Tron. And Eldrazi Tron really lives and dies based on how good Chalice is, because if Chalice is not well positioned, then you really might as well just play regular Tron or play some other deck if you're just playing whatever is best positioned, just playing to win. I do expect my prediction of Tron taking off and Eldrazi Tron falling away to really be actualized here in the coming weeks. And overall, I think that is a good thing for us on the Rock and on other BGx decks. Of course, we don't really love to face Tron ever, but Eldrazi Tron is just miserable in my opinion. Tron is more easily disrupted, more easily teched against, so on and so forth. Moving on, Izzet Phoenix takes a big blow, as mentioned earlier, from the Looting ban. Obviously, this 4-color Hogaak deck is no more. Humans, I suppose, are always going to be a mainstay of the format for the foreseeable future, and if anything, they do benefit from this. You've got to wonder how far the Stoneforge splash will go. Will she make an appearance in Humans? They certainly have an endless stream of threats, cheap threats to equip swords to, and so on and so forth. Obviously requires a little bit of a deck building concession that Humans players might not be willing to make. But either way, I think, if you just only look at the Hogaak ban and the Looting ban, I think the Humans players are pretty happy about this, so we can expect more of a Humans meta share. And for us mid-range players, that's totally fine. They're not a pushover or anything, but they are a deck we should be pretty happy to face. Dredge, as mentioned, definitely going to be reeling from the bans, no question about that. Also, as mentioned earlier, they'll find a way to keep existing, but I don't expect the all-in graveyard decks to be that big of a presence, with the possible exception of the rogue decks, the decks that haven't been seeing much play, like Living End. Mardu Shadow. Yeah, if the format gets more interactive, I think this deck gets a little bit worse. Because it is able to grind to some degree, but I think in general mid-range decks, especially if it's a mid-range meta and they're all packing a lot of value-oriented pieces, are on average able to outgrind Shadow decks. Maybe Mardu's a little bit better at grinding than Crixus, but I do think that ultimately the Death Shadow decks want to be the premier interactive deck in an uninteractive format, and I don't think that's where we're headed, but of course we'll see. Amulet Titan, it probably likes the changes. It's another big mana deck. Tron likes these changes. I don't see why Amulet wouldn't, I guess. So maybe we see more Amulet Titan at the top tables. Storm also probably does like these changes overall, and also Neobrand, so we might see the combo decks getting a little bit of a breath of fresh air. On the other hand, if we do see mid-range decks getting a boost, well, they tend to prey on these combo decks pretty well. So a little bit hard to predict where Storm and Neobrand will go. Then we come to the two affinity variants, Hardened Scales Affinity and Traditional Affinity. And I expect both of these decks to have a new lease on life because they're not getting outraced by the turn 2 Hogaak or the gigantic dredge board any longer, and they can be built in ways that they do make life really difficult for mid-range decks sometimes. Hardened Scales inherently, its inherent plan lines up pretty well against spot removal, definitely can be tricky to deal with, and Affinity is a lot more fragile admittedly, but they do have the ability maybe once again to be the fastest deck in the format besides Neobrand, and they can also play Experimental Frenzy if they want to grind. So again, who knows how this stuff will go, but maybe a new lease on life, and another more artifact-based archetypes that I expect to rise, so keep that in mind. Finally, down here, I guess we'll stop it here. We've got Mardu Pyromancer, which I mentioned, could kind of go either way. I'm skeptical that the Mardu colors, that there's a great deal of incentive to play them without looting in the format any longer. I think even if you want black and white together, blue or green might be your better splash color. Abzan or Esper, they might be better shells for Stoneforge Mystic. And you're not missing out on all that sweet graveyard value because it's no longer enabled by looting, right? So who knows? Maybe Mardu will stay afloat. But finally, of course, the Rock, which I do believe most of my viewers on this channel are mains of, although I have a surprising number of people saying I don't even play green-black decks at all, but I still love the content. So shout out to all of you, but I know we've got Rockers in abundance here, as well as the Jund and the Abzan and the Sultai players, and the non-mid-range players as well, and the Rock. So we are definitely the deck to prey upon Tron. If it's like a Tron and a mid-range meta, Rock is really nice. It's really nicely positioned because we have those Fields of Ruin, we have the high copies of Fulminator Mage and Assassin's Trophy, and of course we have the Collector Oof. Now, my biggest takeaway from that meta breakdown I just did is that Collector Oof is going to be a card you want high numbers of in your deck no matter what BGx variant you're on, in my view. I think Tron will rise. I think Urza Sword will rise. I think Hardened Scales Affinity will rise. And I think Traditional Affinity will rise. And this guy is a Stony Silence on legs. He gets busy beating down with a 2-2. If you're playing Abzan, a little bit of a non-bow with the old Stoneforge Mystic, but you can sideboard accordingly, or you can construct your 75 accordingly. And whether you're on whatever flavor of BGX you currently play, I think Oof is a card you're going to want to play a lot of in the coming weeks. But back to the Rock, I've given you the optimism, I've given you the optimistic take of we are the fair deck that can beat Tron the most reliably, and I do believe that to be true, but there are some bad things that might be a fallout of this banned and restricted announcement as well. So number one, there is yet another fair mid-range deck, and as you all know, a lot of these mid-range mirrors come down to top decks and who can draw better. There's now another mid-range deck alongside Jund in the form of Abzan or Esper or Bant, whoever decides to play SFM, that has a really powerful 2-for-1. Really powerful, inherent, cheap 2-for-1 that is just, man, that's going to be tough for Rock to grind through on a consistent basis, it seems to me. And the other thing about the change is that one of the big appeals to Rock, besides the ability to main deck Fields of Ruin, was the painless mana. And of course, that's still a big appeal. But look, Burn is going to be probably brought down in the meta by the presence of Stoneforge Mystic and Batterskull. The looting decks of the format, which are another incentive to play really painless mana like Mono Red Phoenix, they're just not going to be anywhere near as present or as powerful as they used to be. So the painless mana and the very green-heavy mana, which is very good with Skoos, is just not in as high demand any longer. And that's an unfortunate reality that I think we need to face as Rock players. Another thing I'll mention that's on a slightly pessimistic note is Sword of Feast and Famine is probably one of the better positioned swords, and it is a little bit rough to have pro-black and pro-green on one sword, and the damage trigger is very powerful against us as well. Now, of course, we can have discard, we can remove the sword itself, but you understand the point. This thing is absolutely a beating against us. And if we're talking about white-based mid-range decks with Stoneforge Mystic in them, we might expect Mirran Crusader to see more play than it has in the past, because number one, it's going to be a good BGX mid-range mirror breaker, and number two, just in general, it's a sweet sword wielder. It's got double strike, it's going to proc twice if you're attacking cleanly through with it, and of course if you pair it with like Sword of Fire and Ice, it's got protection from 4 out of 5 colors, and whatever. Like, definitely almost just too cool to pass up. So this is just another very minor thing, but something to be wary about for people who are specifically on green-black rock. We might be facing some incidental hate if cards like Sword of Feast and Famine and Mirran Crusader start seeing a little play, as well as the fact that Stoneforge Mystic is just another 2-for-1 that we don't have access to on the rock that we'll have to fight through that can definitely bury us in some value. The one thing I do want to say, though, is if we are, no matter what we are trying to do in the fair game, whether it be straight up green-black rock, where we want things that are not going to be blown out by opposing value powerhouses like Wrenn and 6, Plague Engineer, Stoneforge Mystic, or whether we're on Jund and we want a thing that survives all of those things as well, or whether we're on Abzan and we want a good proactive clock, good synergy with Lingering Souls, it's got pseudo-evasion, so it's a good sword carrier. My namesake, the Grimflayer, I think this guy's stock has risen as well. Now, I always kind of want to play it, and sometimes I test it as a one-of, and it's good, and it's fine, but maybe it's ultimately not going to make the grade. But I think if there is a really nice shell for Grimflayer, especially given the fact that Bob is not as well positioned now as he has been in the past, it might be Abzan. It might be Abzan alongside Stoneforge Mystic. Again, Flare is a good target for equipping anything that Stoneforge tutors up. Flare is a good proactive clock. You can put Lingering Souls in the bin to get value off of the back end. It's just absolutely awesome in theory. In practice, of course, we'll see how it goes. It dies to all the forms of removal there are, and it doesn't have an ETB trigger, so, and it can get outsized by Shadows and by Anglers and by Tarmogoyfs and by Eldrazi and so on and so forth. You understand the limitations of the card, but I do think its stock has risen. Maybe not as much as our good friend the Collector Oof, who, by the way, is good against opposing Stoneforge Mystics as well as all of the other artifact decks I expect to rise, but definitely want to keep the good old Flare in mind in this new format with Stoneforge Mystic free. All right, my friends, so that was me shooting from the hip as soon as I got home from work, bringing you my reaction as quickly as possible to the momentous changes that have befallen our beloved format. I think they're great overall. I'm very, very psyched. And, this was a little bit all over the place. We talked about the meta a bit. We talked about cards whose stock might rise and fall. We talked about the various shades of BGx. And this is all just very first impressions. So, of course, as always, this is a community. This is a collaborative effort to find the best rock deck and the best Jund, Abs, and Sultai deck, the best fair magic in general. So feel free to let your thoughts rip in the comments. We'd all love to hear it. And, if you think I got something wrong, if you disagree with one of my predictions or my prognostications, that is totally fine. I might well be wrong. It's very difficult to predict how these things will shake out. But in any case, no more Hogaak, no more looting. Yes to Stoneforge Mystic. So exciting times, my friends. Very exciting indeed. And hopefully the dawn of a fairer, more interactive, more skill testing, more decision-based format. I certainly hope so. And I know you do too. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all Patreon supporters out there. Next up on the channel, a Sultai variant that you have never seen before, a donation league. Gonna be fun. We've still got elves on the back burner, but of course now people are gonna want me to play Abzan, and of course we've got to revisit the rock now that the format is so different. So lots and lots of gameplay coming your way in the near future. Fear not, stay tuned, and I look forward to hearing from you as always. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day. I will talk to you soon.